Funny. It was
Now,
so funny.
capitalism.
Yeah.
Here's when people start talking about capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
and we talk about capitalism uplifting poor people.
Mm-hmm.
One of the issues that a lot of people have in this country is when you ship jobs overseas and you ship companies start manufacturing things overseas for essentially pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like it's one of the great contradictions
Right.
to the progressives in America, that they complain about capitalism on a fucking iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
Because if
Right.
you knew where that iPhone was, if you went down to the factory where that iPhone was manufactured, you'd be heartbroken. If you went further to where the minerals are dug out of the ground in the Congo, you'd be devastated.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the reality of capitalism. That's the reality of sending jobs overseas. The cure to that is a more even distribution of wealth within the company, meaning that the company would have to, and I'm not picking on Apple, like any company, name them, they would have to pay the people that work there a decent living wage with great benefits and health insurance and dental and all the stuff that people want and need in order to feel secure and safe. Give them a great working environment, don't overwork them, and now how much money do you have? Because the amount of money that Apple has put aside, and obviously I'm an Apple fan. I have an Apple phone right here. I'm not picking on Apple. But they are one of the richest companies that's ever existed on the face of planet Earth. But how are they doing that? One of the ways they're doing that is by paying people very little to make their products that they sell for a giant amount of money.
Yeah.
So what's the solution to that?
Okay. Well, let's
Is the solution to pay people a fair amount? And if you do that, is the solution to pay people a fair amount in another country? Or is the solution to pay people a fair amount here where we can regulate it? Because we do manufacture some things here, but we manufacture way less than we used to because it costs too much money to do so. But that word too much, or that phrase too much, is bullshit. It's not that it costs too much. It's just that it costs more. And they don't want to pay it. They would rather just reap in profits, and the way they do that is on the backs of poor people.
Yeah, well,
now, if you do that on the backs of poor people,
we could take that apart a bit.
right?
And so,
but here's my question: if you really wanted to make these other countries, like third world countries, and raise them up and really increase the economy, what you would do is pay people in third world countries where you have these plants the same amount that you would have to pay them in America. Then you'd have a complete change in those environments.
Okay, so we can take that apart a bunch of ways. I mean,
okay, so we can stop right there for a minute. I think that's a good spot to talk about it for a second.
And I think Peterson's response might be similar. Well, there might be some correlation maybe in the response, but because the first thing I would ask is compared to what?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the important question. This is where we get lost in trying to understand the world today, comparing it to different time frames. Okay, so remember China or the Congo, wherever, what these people's lives were like before. Remember what Americans' lives were before 150 years ago. All of human history, we have struggled to survive, let alone prosper. The majority, 99% of human history, has been a struggle to just literally survive.
It's probably more than 99%, actually.
Yeah, probably more, but at least 99%. It's just now, by the way, in the last 100 years that we have the life that we do today. The fact that you have an iPhone that sends a signal to space, that bounce off a satellite and come back to you, and you can instant message people pretty much. You can instantly communicate with anybody around the world. So the advancements that we have are relatively, well, they're not relatively, they are new. They're brand new. Literally, we have no idea what kind of technology and advancements that we have. And so I always ask the question, compared to what?
The other compared to what to ask is what jobs would those people have if, say, the Apple factory was not located there in China?
That's another question.
So their working conditions are terrible compared to what?
What's the alternative?
Yeah, so if Apple leaves and they have factories just in the U.S., then what are the conditions for the people that work at those factories then after that? Is it automatically better afterwards? Do other companies magically move in there and pay people more money or whatever? And we'll talk about the money thing here in a second, because it's not as bad as what people think it is. I've been diving really deeply into this today. And then there's just a general thing that he does that's wrong, which is saying that Basically, Apple should pay the factory workers in China the same thing that they would have to pay people here in the U.S., which, by the way, would make those people the richest people in China if they were getting paid the same that they would be getting paid to manufacture things in the U.S.
Well, and then Apple would just move the factory to the U.S.
Then
It wouldn't matter.
That's the thing. Like, there is an advantage to having those factories there because they do save on the labor some. There's other things to them being located in China that help them out as well, because a lot of the materials for the iPhones are already over there. So one thing they also have to factor in is if they had the factories in the U.S., then they would have to ship all of the materials that they need into the U.S. to be able to build everything. And instead, they can make the things in China and not have to ship them overseas to actually manufacture everything. China's also got a lot of engineers and people that are very technically skilled. And every year, I think the number is more than the total amount that's in the U.S. And so it's, there's a lot of different parts of this. He says that because they're paying them pennies on the dollar compared to what people would make in the U.S., they're able to reap in all of these massive profits. And that's also not the case either. The cost for manufacturing the iPhone per device is about 50 cents for the labor side of things. And then all the material sides add in a few $100 more on top of that. But you got about 50 cents per device for the labor. And so that's not the thing that if they raise that up to $1 or $1.50 per device, you're not going to see all of Apple's profits just disappear after that. That's not going to be a massive change. We have to talk about these pay scales relative to the standards of living in the countries and the buying power that pay has. And so one thing I have here on the screen already, you'll have to excuse us today because we're getting in the weeds on a couple topics, like deep in the weeds on a couple topics. So we'll try to take our time going through this. The starting wage for an iPhone worker in China is $3.15 per hour, which this is from Investopedia. They compare that to the minimum wage in the U.S., which is $7.25 per hour. And so I saw several other articles today talking about how low the pay is compared to what people in the U.S. make and all that. And it's easy to look at those two things and say, well, obviously the people in China are getting hosed. They're obviously just there so they can take advantage of people. And so they can just reap those massive profits off of people. But when we dig a little bit further into the details, that's not the case. He also says that they're worth all of this money because they've been able to manufacture the iPhones for pennies on the dollar. We talked about that a second ago. That's not really quite the case either. Apple's worth, they got up to $2 trillion not long ago. They're probably not up there anymore. This is their profits. This is since 2005. And by the way, all these numbers, this is their net profits, what they come up with. And all those numbers since 2005, I realized they've been a company for a long time, but this was the most recently available data. All of those numbers add up to about $568 billion in net profits since 2005. Now, that's a lot of money. It's quite a bit, but they're worth almost $2 trillion. And so how does that happen? That happens because the valuation of the company is not based on the money that they're bringing in. It's partly based on the money that they're bringing in. But if that were solely the case, then you wouldn't have thousands of companies in the stock exchange that are worth billions of dollars that have never made any money before. The value of the company is what people are willing to pay per share for the company. And sometimes it's correlated to the earnings that they're making. Sometimes it isn't. And so you can't just say that they're worth $2 trillion because they've been able to reap all of these benefits off of the people that are working in China. Those dogs don't float when you look at it. Let me see what else we got in here. So we mentioned they were getting $3.15 an hour for the workers there. That comes out to about 20 yuan, right? Yuan, Chinese yuan, is what it is? Yeah. So the average pay, by the way, let's see, Beijing, the minimum wage right there is around 24. You go down to some of these other ones, Henan, 19's the top, 15 is the minimum. You keep going down the list, and actually you go down to where one of their biggest factories is located in here. Let me see where it is. I don't remember. It goes down to 12, down to 14. And remember they're around 20 per hour is where they're at. So they're actually doing pretty good. You can't really compare them to Beijing and Shanghai because those are the biggest cities. And you look at what people make in New York and LA compared to what people make in Nashville, and you can understand that you can't just compare to what people are making in the biggest cities. And so that's another thing. And then we were talking about what the buying power is. So I compared Zhengzhou, which is where one of their biggest factory cities is, like an Apple city over there, to Nashville. Nashville's not the cheapest city in the world, but it's a lot cheaper than a lot of other big cities. But this Zhengzhou city over there is not a real big place. It's mainly because Apple is there, from what I can understand. And Charlie, when you look at these differences in the cost of living over here, look at the difference compared to Nashville.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty big. So like a meal, you got the 76% lower in that city in China. They got beer on here. That's super important. Let me see. The beer is 50% lower. Coke or Pepsi, 67% lower. Water, 78% lower in these places in China. So when you look at these, the important part that you got to remember is when we look at their $3.15 per hour and say, whoa, they're making less than half of the minimum wage in the United States. They're getting hosed over here. But then you look at the differences. Now, from what I can tell, the Chinese are getting hosed on milk.
Definitely getting hosed on the milk.
It's 114% more than Nashville, but then everything else is less. Rice, 75%. You know, they get some good rice discounts over there. Local cheese is more expensive. That's the only two things that are more expensive there, cheese and milk. I wonder if those are correlated at all.
So they're not making many charcuterie boards over there.
Chicken filet is 70%. Let me see. Apples, 50% lower. Oranges, 70% lower. Tomato, 85% lower.
Bats.
Those come free. Let's see. Local transport, 85% lower. Taxi, 80% lower. Gas is more expensive there. All right, so we got one that's more expensive.
Cars are more expensive.
Cars are more expensive. Well, the Toyota Corolla is more expensive. The Volkswagen Golf is less when you look at that. Electricity, 75% cheaper. Let's see, prepaid mobile, 76%. Internet, 85% cheaper. Your fitness clubs over there, 23%. But if you want to rent a tennis court, I'm sorry to tell you, there's 66% higher to rent a tennis court. Mm-hmm. In this city in China. Preschool, so childcare, 73% lower, 74% lower for international primary school. Apartment, 80% lower to 85% lower. Anyway, as you go through here, the point that we're trying to make is that you can't just simply talk about what the people are making per hour and say that they're getting taken advantage of compared to what people in the United States are making. It's not an accurate comparison.
Right.
At all.
What you get paid actually doesn't matter. What's the purchasing power?
Yeah.
Like if I paid Nate the same amount of money in the face value of gold coins, his purchasing power would be much higher, and my labor costs would be much higher than the dollar amount, because you have to factor in a purchasing power of that means of exchange. Okay.
Well, it's like if you compared New York and Nashville and you said, well, family members making $90,000 a year in Nashville, they could be making $200,000 a year in New York. And you say, well, in Nashville, they're getting screwed. The same company's paying people less than half the amount in Nashville. But then what are all the cost of living expenses here in Nashville? They're just not accurate comparisons. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
The other thing I want to say too is that this isn't a product of capitalism, by the way. Do you think that there won't be any minors in socialism or communism?
You mean like underage people or people like mining for
minerals to produce things like iPhones?
Just making sure.
Do you think the USSR didn't have people mining for iron and making cars and in factories working or anything like that?
Yeah, but they got free food once a month.
Yeah. a little bit of free food.
Yeah,
And
just
so
a little.
this isn't a product of capitalism. Like we need to make stuff, right? This is what Elon Musk talked about on the Joe Rogan show. Actually, no, it was on the Rogan podcast not that long ago when he was talking about getting back to work from coronavirus. It's like people have to make stuff regardless of what system you're in, and the alternative. We know what the alternative is for at least people in China, which was starving to death in the fields. Right before any sort of capitalism made its way over to China, the plight of the Chinese people was death and starvation.
It's pretty bad.
It was real bad.
Yeah.
Really bad. They lost hundreds of millions of people were starving to death. And so you have to draw the comparisons, okay? Like what are we comparing it to? Because that matters. That variable matters. And then would this exist in any other type of system? The answer is yes. And the thing we have to compare is capitalism the best system we have so far at producing the most amount of stuff and wealth for the most amount of people, the most efficient way possible? And so far, that answer is yes.
Well,
and who are we to sit here and judge, someone else and what they decide to do with their life over there? Because I guarantee you, people are lining up to work at the factory because it's a much better job than starving to death in the rice fields.
what they're saying is, if I were the economic planner, then I would be doing a better job than everyone else. That's how they feel. Let's play Peterson's response, a minute of that real quick. He actually had a good defense of capitalism and a good definition of what capitalism was. So we'll play that real quick, and then we'll get on to the other thing, which is the 143 medical studies I read today. So we'll talk about that.
Part of the advantage to manufacturing things where wages are relatively low is you give those countries a competitive advantage. So part of the reason that there aren't millions of people starving in China is because even the Chinese communists woke up enough to realize that if they opened up their economies, that free market is nothing different than allowing unrestricted choice among consumers in some sense. So when we're talking about the free market, we should be careful about what we're talking about. It's like you get to have choice about what you buy. That's the central spirit of free market capitalism. Exporting those jobs stopped a huge proportion of the Chinese from living in absolute privation, and likely decreased the probability of like a broad-scale war. So, and it also brought the Chinese into the economy, which is a big deal. The Chinese produce more engineers every year than the Americans have engineers. And so now we've unlocked an unbelievable amount of brain power. And that's produced an insane technological revolution. Now, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of that was done on the backs of the American working class. And I think that the Democrats abandoning the working class when they were in that state of privation was a catastrophe of public policy. And also part of the reason why Trump got elected. But it isn't obvious to me that exporting those jobs was a bad long-term decision. Because, well, you want a world where 20 million Chinese are starving? That's not good by any measure, right?
But is that the only way that they don't starve? The only way they don't starve is if iPhones are manufactured there for pennies on the dollar?
Yes.
Really?
Well, no other solutions ever worked.
But that doesn't mean they can't work. If they
it
work
might.
In America, it might?
Well,
really?
Well, I don't know, Joe, because that's a good question, but for me, the problem with utopian theories is that they're hypothetical. So I like to look at what's actually worked and what.
Okay, we'll leave it at that so we can get on to the next one, because we just got like 15, 20 minutes here that we can spend going into the next one, and the next one is pretty complicated as well.
That's a great discussion because it gets brought up all the time, like, slave labor and all this stuff. It's like, well, they were starving to death beforehand. And that's what Peterson was getting into. It's like, okay, take away the hypothetical utopias. What has actually worked and what has not worked? We've tried all sorts of things as human beings. The experiments, the data are in, right? And so this is a much better life. Now, albeit I want their lives to be better. I hope all the Chinese become rich millionaires, through working that process. And I think eventually they can get there. I think a lot of people can get there. But this is the process of human beings striving to advance themselves. At one point in America, we were making 21 an hour too.
Yeah. Joe Bizzle also made a good point. Something that drove me nuts on the episode yesterday was Rogan used the example of Detroit as a great example of how to pay people properly. And so the question would be, how did that work out for everyone?
Yeah,
What's Detroit look like right now?
it's probably the greatest city in the United States.
The unions came in, the UAW came in, the city came in. They kept raising all of the wages for everyone, and they basically made it impossible to continue those factories where they were. They had to go elsewhere, and so it works until it doesn't. You know, Venezuela looked great there for a couple of years, and then it didn't anymore. And so we have to consider things more than even a 10-year span of time. We can't just look at that and say, oh, look, Detroit looked great for 10, 15 years when everyone started buying cars and they were making them there and they were getting paid well. How did it actually end up? We've got the data on that. We know how it ended up.